Hi, I'm Lane Malone, and this week I'm going to talk about tension and pacing in video games. Tension measures the player's stress levels as they are confronted with obstacles, and pacing measures the rhythm that is established by creating and resolving tension. When I define tension, I like to break it down into two components: motivation and displacement. Motivation is the urge the player feels to complete an objective, and types of motivation vary from game to game. In horror games like Dead Space, the player is motivated primarily by self-preservation. In many RPG types, like the peaceful Stardew Valley, the player is motivated by self-edification. In competitive esports games like Rocket League, the player is motivated by the overwhelming urge to win. Some games have no pressing objective, and that player is motivated by sensation alone. No Man's Sky is a grand sci-fi adventure game that presents you with no story, objective, or physical boundaries, as the universe you explore is procedurally generated. It's like running on a treadmill. The game keeps generating things in front of you as you move forward. Structurally, motivation is delivered to the player through three main ways: through story and context, through challenge, and through style or pleasure. Most games have some form of story or context. Simulators and puzzle games often provide context without any sort of story. This just means that the player is prompted to do something, and that context remains static as the player progresses through the game. It doesn't develop itself like the typical plot structure of a movie or a book, with rising action, climax, falling action, etc. Mini Metro is about creating an efficient metro system by drawing lines between an increasing field of stations and passengers. There's no story at all, but the context gives the player enough of a reason to explore the mechanics. And sometimes the player's motivation is almost predetermined when they buy the game. The people who bought Euro Truck Simulator 2017 just want to drive trucks. Following a storyline asks the player to emotionally invest in the outcome, which is always a tricky thing to accomplish. I'm going to make a video in the future about plot and player agency, and I'll dive deep into how this is accomplished. But if your story or context is established correctly, then the player will most likely stick around to see how things shake out. Dead Space does a great job of establishing the context of the game world and striking a balance between motivating the player by their will to survive and their curiosity to develop the narrative. Dead Space paces itself very well by doing this, and I'll break down why here in a minute. Another way games appeal to players is through challenge. These games present the player with tremendous obstacles that require skill to conquer, and motivation for playing these games stems from the philosophy, get good. The investment that the player makes is time and practice to develop their skill, and the payoff is the sweet nectar of victory. Dark Souls and other From Software games are notorious for their keyboard-crushing difficulty and non-permissive save systems. This means that you die a lot, and you can't just reboot from your latest autosave. This kind of difficulty scares off a lot of players, but it beckons to the players who want to test themselves against the game's staggering odds. Most multiplayer games fall into this category. Rocket League and Overwatch are highly competitive multiplayer games that provide players with constant challenge and by pitting them against other players with similar skills. These games have in-depth systems like the physics of Rocket League and the team composition of Overwatch that allow the game to be accessible at different skill levels. And having players of different skill levels creates what we call the skill gap, and this is simply the difference in performance between experienced and new players. Let's look at Rocket League for this. New players who are not familiar with the physics will struggle to even touch the ball, as they get dunked on by more experienced players. But as they play more, they learn how the ball moves, and they start being able to do simple maneuvers like blocking and shooting. As the game matches them with players of similar skill, simple blocking and shooting is no longer enough to win, and the player has to get creative to score goals. After much more practice, this player has learned to hit the ball in midair, position himself properly on the field, and communicate with his teammates. As this player's outside life dissolves away, he learns that Rocket League calculates the ball path after a collision with vector addition instead of incident angles. He uses this knowledge to make aerial goals, advance kickoffs, and show off with his sick freestyles. Now when this player plays against someone new, he dunks on them. The new player, being dunked on, now feels the pain of defeat and is motivated to get good so that he can one day dunk on others. This is called the RL cycle. Rocket League has a huge skill gap because the physics system is robust and in-depth, and it allows players to develop a mastery of it. This makes it highly competitive and gives players much more of a thrill when they score a sick goal because they have to really invest the time in-game to get that level of skill. Another way that games motivate players is through pleasure or style. In other words, people play the game because it's fun. This is a lot less objective than the other two categories, so it's kind of a catch-all for games that have no story to follow or challenge to motivate players. These games may rely on a specific art style or a particular play style to deliver the intended experience. These games tend to be indie developed and can range from open-ended or atmospheric exploration games to games with a strong artistic message. And like I said earlier, tension is made up of motivation and displacement. And displacement is the distance you are from completing your objective. This can, and often does, take the form of physical distance, but is better to be thought of as the amount of work you have left to do before you complete your objective. This applies to games of all genres. Tension is created when a player's motivation to complete their objective is contested by obstacles in their way. The composition of the obstacles directly affect the way it creates tension. Displacement is very closely related to the size and scope of the game, because it deals with the in-game state and all of the steps taken to get there. All of the obstacles a player encounters exist in the space between them and their goal, and the size of that metaphoric space affects how the player perceives their progression through the game. This is the foundation of pacing and how it affects the overall experience. Pacing measures the time a game takes to build and resolve tension. Pacing applies to the narrative as well as to the player's momentum. Good pacing is stratified, having an overarching tension cycle that encompasses the entire game, and smaller cycles that are contained within sections of the game. In practice, this gives the player variation in their gameplay by alternating between high and low intensity sections of the game. This also allows the game to build tension over time as the player reaches the climax of the game. This is the same method of pacing that is used by professionals to write novels and movies. Ideally, the cycles of the narrative and the gameplay are in sync. If you've ever studied writing, you know that tension is the driving force for any story. It's what motivates readers to read because they're seeking resolution. This begs the question, can a game be compelling even with no story or objective, i.e., no structure for delivering tension? The French novelist Gustave Flaubert once aspired to write a book about nothing, and in 1857 he came up with Madame Bovary, a novel so dependent on the style it was written in that the plot itself was almost non-existent and played second chair to his word choice and grammar. His work was so influential that he shaped what the modern novel is today. People read his book because they enjoyed the way he wrote, not necessarily what he wrote about. Radio stations do the same thing, play music that people like the sound of. Who cares about the message? To answer the question, can games be compelling even with no story or objective? Yes and no. It's a tricky balance. I wager that there are few games that subsist purely on style, and that most games that provide no objectives only appear to do so. This is because as a medium, video games offer interactivity, and if the player has any agency at all, then the player is making decisions, and every time a player makes a decision, it is to affect the game state in some way. Minecraft and No Man's Sky are good examples of open-ended exploration games that have no compelling narrative or challenging gameplay elements. No Man's Sky is about exploring an infinitely generated universe and discovering species of plants and animals. Minecraft is about digging and building. They're both very relaxing and easy to get lost in. Atmosphere is nice, but it doesn't put any meat on the game's bones, so to speak. By not providing a checklist of objectives, some players don't know what to do and lose interest. This is unavoidable. However, Minecraft has sold over 100 million copies and is to date the second highest selling video game in history. The reason these games work is because of player agency. In open-ended sandbox game, the player sets their own objectives. They can create tension on their own by simply deciding to build a house or explore that horizon, or build a working telephone and order Domino's pizza in real life. And that's not a joke, that actually happened. The game's environment then ideally populates the space with obstacles like finding enough resources or encountering enemies or trying to figure out the way you're going to design a phone. Essentially, these games give the players the ability to make decisions of their own design. By providing the player with access to in-depth systems and tools, they allow the player to create complex goals and then complete them in interesting ways. So the game is only about nothing if you want it to be. These games do nothing to regulate the pace at which tension is built and resolved, however. And since the player, without even realizing it, does all of this themselves, how do developers make sure that the player doesn't inadvertently ruin their experience by creating too much or too little tension? The way that they do this is they provide the player with a sense of progress, and this is called momentum. The player's momentum is an important component in pacing because the player needs to constantly feel like they are making progress. The quickest way to get most players to quit is to make them feel like they have hit a wall. In other words, their forward momentum has stalled. The player also cannot have too much forward momentum because then they'll blow through the entire mid-game and the final conclusion won't feel earned. There's a delicate balance that needs to be struck. In Dark Souls, dying over and over again gets frustrating and can easily inspire a chair thrown across the room kind of rage quit. However, part of Dark Souls' strategy is trial and error, so dying is part of the process. Let's look at Dead Space again. This game is excellent at creating tension. Enemies pop out of walls and charge right at you. These ambushes create an ever-present anxiety as you move through the narrow hallways and traverse sections of the chaotic space station. This game gives you long, tense build-ups and throws a bunch of enemies at you, and then gives you a moment to catch your breath. The narrative is expertly weaved into the gameplay as well. The pacing, however, isn't perfect. The overall narrative only builds tension more and more as you progress, which is what it should do, but the game constantly reroutes you away from that objective, so you never feel like you've really made much progress by the time you get into the next section of the game. I also get fatigued by the anxiety of Dead Space, so I can only play in short bursts, but I still think it's a great game. The pacing of No Man's Sky isn't perfect either. Since the game is open-ended, it plays very slowly. You can get yourself into combat, but most of the game is resource gathering. Since the game has no narrative arcs, you would expect the pacing to be pretty consistent, and for the most part it is, until it peters out after a few hours in. The problem with the pacing is that the player loses all momentum. No Man's Sky is ambitious and it tries to create an endless universe. The problem is that, as an exploration-based game, there isn't enough content to fill the universe. The procedural generation is impressively large, but sadly lacks enough variation to sustain the player's interest. The entire context of the game is discovering new stuff, but after seeing a handful of planets, you feel like you've seen them all. The player no longer feels like they are making progress, so they lose interest. The universe of No Man's Sky feels empty and repetitive, which is tragic considering the amount of potential the game had. To sum this all up, pacing makes or breaks a game. Examining the different ways games pace themselves has made me appreciate the ones that are finely tuned or truly unique. Establishing a good rhythm of play is a crucial tool for crafting a game's intended experience. Thanks for watching. Next week I'll be making a video on narratives and player agency, so I'll see you then.
Oh yeah.